Welcome back. This is being filmed on March 22nd, 2016. Our guest in this segment is Stephen Portman. Stephen is with the Together Against Poverty Society, and we're going to be talking about homelessness in Victoria. So welcome, Stephen. And you and I were just talking about the need for a tent city, and I thought, has it come to that we need tent cities? And you said yes, at the moment we do.
We do, and I think if someone had asked me if I ever wanted to spend my time and energy fighting for people's rights to sleep in a tent city, I would have said that's a crazy proposition. I think it's deplorable that we've gotten to the point where people are forced to seek survival shelter outdoors in a tent city. But one thing I've seen with the creation of a tent city here in Victoria, where we have no other feasible alternative housing for people, they've been able to develop a community amongst one another. And I've seen people living at super intense city that in all my work as an anti-poverty activist, I've got to know throughout the years, and I've watched those people heal in the community that they're currently living in. Is it ideal? Far from it. If there was another reasonable alternative where they could go to build the kind of community they have at super intensity, where they were housed, where their needs were met, that would be ideal. And that's what we're fighting for, and that's what we want to see. But for the here and now, I don't see a reasonable alternative to the community that they've created and where they currently reside. And should that community be broken up by force, should the Supreme Court of BC grant an injunction to the provincial government to remove the residents of that tent city, my question has always been, where to? Where do they go? So the people living there presently, if the police were to move in and push them off of that green space onto the sidewalk surrounding the courthouse, back to the alleyways and doorways of the city of Victoria, back to our municipal parks, where they'll be moved along by police officers every morning, where people will be sitting in isolation, dispersed, where local service providers can't find them and provide them the services that they need, can't administer harm reduction supplies to prevent further death from overdose in this community. So you kind of laughed at me when you said, do we need a tent city right now? And I take that to be a disagreement. I think we do. I'm appalled that we do. But I'm certainly sure that right now, this is what we need. And I don't think the province is going to come to the table and provide the housing solutions, the real solutions that we need, without that visible presence, drawing attention to the public and to decision makers, showing them that decades of bad public policy with respect to the provision of social housing and social services has created this situation in the first
What's
place.
the impact on the neighborhood around there that exists right now around the tent city on Quadra? Because I know there's apartment buildings very close. I've heard that there are a lot of complaints, of course, from those people. Is that correct, or?
No, that is correct. I think anyone who housed resident of Victoria that's living next to about 100 homeless people,
Yes.
in an unregulated sheltering site are going to have some complaints. And there have been complaints, and they're legitimate complaints and very real. And I certainly wouldn't want to take anything away from the neighborhood around the courthouse that's had to deal with this. But whenever this gets brought up, I always have to come back to the point that, yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's an inconvenience in this present situation. But if we go back pre-November, before the establishment of the tent city, we had 20 encampments spread throughout the city of Victoria.
Yes, including in my neighborhood, several.
Yeah,
yes,
where
yes.
neighbors were complaining about the nuisance of this sheltering everywhere. So I don't think it's any worse than it was prior to. In fact, I think having it isolated in this place where we can better support them to manage their own community has resulted in fewer complaints to the Vic PD as a whole.
Do you think where it is now is a reasonable place, or is there I mean, if you could pick and choose, is there a better spot where this could be set up?
Yeah, homes. you know,
okay. So
there shouldn't be a tent city in our community.
And let's talk about that, because that is the underlying problem. There's not enough places for people to live, and that's true right through our society. I think that's one of the reasons why house prices are so high for everybody who can afford to have a place, either rent or buy, is that there aren't enough places to live. What a failure of our both government and private sector to create a shortage of housing, and everybody's paying the price.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, in Budget 2016, we saw the introduction of a $100 million prosperity fund.
Yes.
$100 million prosperity fund. For who? For why? To what end? I'm not sure. But a $100 million prosperity fund, when we have thousands of people without the means to shelter themselves in a home, that basic right of a home can't be met by this government, but we can have a $100 million prosperity fund, baffles the mind. It's not as if the province of British Columbia does not have the resources to address this issue in a meaningful way and swiftly. Since the tent city's been established, the province has spent in excess of $5 million in the city of Victoria, largest investment that they've made in years to provide some housing options for the people there. Is it enough? No, they've underestimated the breadth of the problem they created. But it's the first time that they've actually been pushed to make that kind of investment. And so I hope that the province recognizes that they underestimated the province and brings in some more of the resources, potentially from the $100 million prosperity fund, to actually provide housing for people. That is our goal in this fight.
So when people in the field, and it's a huge field now, it's like an industry.
Oh, there's a poverty industry, no question.
What do the people who are in there say about how do we get the housing? I mean, really, we just have to build it. We just have to build more housing.
Yeah, I mean, you need land and money.
Yeah.
And there's been significant movement in this area from the regional government, from the Capital Regional Hospital District Board, who recently passed the Regional Housing First Initiative, which is $30 million from the Capital Regional Hospital District that is marked. It's waiting there. It's ready for shovels to go in the ground. We're waiting for $30 million from the provincial government to match that fund before we can push ahead. Now, that $60 million is going to house and support 367, which is the target number from the research, of the chronically underhoused in this community. We can solve homelessness. Communities do it. We have a plan. The chess pieces are in play. All we need is this provincial government to say that housing is a priority for us. People shouldn't be living on the streets in economic refugee camps. They should have a home. And if they came to the table, we could do that. And I think any nonprofit housing provider or nonprofit service provider in the region knows what I'm saying is true. We can solve this crisis, and I think we're almost there. We just need this provincial government to come to the table meaningfully.
And the federal government?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, constitutionally it is the prerogative of the provincial government, but there's been a major role for the federal government in the provision of social housing. And up until the mid-1990s, there were substantial investments from the federal government that provided, worker housing, low-income housing, and social housing. And I think there's some willingness at the table at the federal government, and certainly the provincial government needs that support, and we want to see the federal government come to the table. The reason I harp on the provincial government here is because it's not just bricks and mortar housing. It's the provision of a social safety net that allows people to access housing.
Yeah.
Now, when we have a welfare rate that's been stuck at $375 per month for shelter since 2007, within a market like the city of Victoria, where our market rental for a bachelor is $769, that's why we have homeless people. So we need to increase our income assistance rate at the same time that we need to increase the number of units of affordable housing, and that's shelter rate affordable housing, the welfare rate affordable housing, if we want everyone in our community to live in a home. And so that's why I think the provincial government really needs to take a leadership role there. Should the federal government come to the table? Absolutely. But I can't wait for the federal government. The people living on the street, the meat on the street can't wait. I think the provincial government has an opportunity and a responsibility morally to get this done now.
And I've always thought that we don't really have to build necessarily low income or we just have to have more, because if you have more, the rates are going to come down. Just supply and demand. But there seems to be, I call it an artificial shortage.
Right.
And that is the underlying. I mean, even if you gave enough money to people who are currently homeless and they moved into a place, it's almost as if the rates would go up and somebody else would get forced out. There just isn't enough. And that's kind of the underlying problem that has to get solved.
Sure.
So where we are right now, are positive things going to happen?
Yeah, we're going to hear back from the Chief Justice very shortly on whether or not they'll be granting the application of the provincial government for injunctive relief to remove the people from the tent city. I'm optimistic that we might win that court case, and my organization has worked very hard to bring that forward. And should we win the day, I think there's an opportunity for the province to actually come back to the table and stop spending taxpayer money and resources trying to fight poor homeless people in the court, but to actually get something done on housing. And I think I'm optimistic that they might see that as the correct path. So we'll see where we go.
We're going to run overtime a couple of minutes here because I've seen recently pictures out of Vancouver and here as well, where neighbors of the areas where they're going to create more permanent housing are literally up in arms because they don't want this problem as they see it coming into their neighborhood. For example, Mount St. Edwards, right? That's
Sure.
An old place that is being renovated to take
Seniors' care home.
Yeah, take in close to 100 units.
Mm-hmm.
Can things like that operate with no or very minimal impact on the neighborhood?
Thank you for the question. Since Mount Edwards has opened, and many of the residents of the tent city have moved in there, including homeless individuals from various other shelters, there have been no complaints about the residents that are there. These kinds of supportive housing units are in people's neighborhoods right now, and they don't even know it, right? Certainly people, when they hear that there are low-income people moving into supportive housing in their neighborhood, there's a very visceral reaction to that. We're deeply invested in our homes and our neighborhoods, and there's always that general concern. But where we actually look at the facts, and the facts often get ignored when these kinds of things come into play, supportive low-income housing in your neighborhood does not mean greater nuisance in your neighborhood. It does not mean that your house value will drop. That's across the board in the city of Victoria. I challenge the individuals who object to having low-income housing in their neighborhood to provide an example where that low-income supportive housing, in cases like Mount Edwards, where there's wraparound supports for people, where it's actually been a major nuisance in that neighborhood. So I think that the neighborhood around Mount Edwards has every right to be consulted, and I'm not sure they were consulted in a way that was appropriate before Mount Edwards was put into place. But Mount Edwards is a stone's throw from 100 people, totally unregulated, sleeping in tents without supports, and the actual number of complaints in that neighborhood with the development of this low-income housing compared to last year is almost negligible. So, I mean, yeah, I think people have
there
a right.
is some hope that if we do things right, we really can solve this problem.
Yeah, we just have to do it right. And I think that in 2016, we've come to a place where we know how to do this well. We know how to help build inclusive communities and inclusive low-income housing projects that don't impede the character and the nature of a neighborhood, but in fact add to it and enhance neighborhoods. And I think that's where we're going, and that's where we need to go. I'd much rather have people living in low-income supportive housing in my neighborhood where they're getting the help that they need, where they have the supports that they need, than living under a tarp in the park beside my house.
I've heard, and I don't know if you know about this, but that the shelter cost for a shelter, literally a mat on a concrete floor at a church basement or something like that, we're paying $75 a night for that. Is that a correct number?
I don't know that that number is correct, but
Okay.
I certainly know that the cost of servicing homelessness against actually providing a home for someone is incredibly disproportionate. We're paying far more in public resources, in social justice resources, in our police force, and in healthcare costs servicing this homelessness crisis than we would be if we simply just provided people a house. It's pretty simple.
It's a horrible disaster, not only for the homeless, but really for our whole society, and I really, really hope it can get solved. So as you said, when is the court going to rule on this tense?
Yeah, so we don't know. I think it'll be very soon.
Okay.
Likely next week at some point. The judge is waiting for some correspondence back from our counsel and from the Attorney General's office. But we expect a decision at some point next week.
Stephen Portman, thank you very much.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
We can solve this problem. We've got to solve this problem, and our leadership has got to get on board and do it. Thanks very much for watching this segment.